more in the course of the presentation include the grants that we make to nonprofit organizations and the first-party technology that we build on top of the Dataverse platform. So over the course of the next hour, I'll talk about what the nonprofit common data model is, the capabilities that it supports, but I'd like to start by telling you a quick story about restaurants. So the restaurant industry, for those of you who may have had a chance to work in it at some point in your lives, is, I would say, really unique and wonderful because it's one of the fields where your skills determine what you can do, right? And it doesn't require fancy certifications. It doesn't require significant advanced education. And as a result, it can be a great pathway for people who are potentially struggling with poverty, have experienced homelessness, maybe are returning from the prison system, to get reintroduced into the workforce and rejoin and to rebuild their lives. So a couple of years ago, I had the opportunity to work with a social enterprise which runs several restaurants that also have training kitchens that welcome folks who have had barriers to work into the community. And over time, they grew from one restaurant with one training kitchen to 5 restaurants with multiple training kitchens. They had systems responsible for staffing. They had systems responsible for ingredients and ordering. They had point of sale systems that were collecting information on what were the most popular dishes, what was being ordered. They had systems that kept track of their volunteers, their donations, their grants from the state, from public entities. And none of these systems spoke to each other. There was no data strategy. There was a multi-million-dollar nonprofit that had evolved. Oh, and I'm getting a request to turn on live closed captioning. So I don't have the option of starting transcription on the recording, but I may be able to do that in PowerPoint. Roz, is there any chance you'd be able to start the transcription on here?
Hi, yes, it is enabled actually. Transcript is enabled by default. Here we go. So we've just enabled again. There you go, Alex.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate it. And Eduardo, thank you for pointing that out. I want to make sure we keep this conversation accessible. So as I was saying, you can have a multi-million-dollar nonprofit without a solid data strategy, without data infrastructure to collect information from its multiple sources. And that's one of the areas that we've been investing in and hope to discuss over the next hour. So I'll spend a bit more time setting a foundation of what the challenges that nonprofits face are. I'll spend a couple of minutes setting a foundation for what Dataverse is. I assume that there is a pretty solid shared understanding, but because we're on the first day of the summit, there may be folks who are new to this universe. I'll just spend a couple of minutes relaying that groundwork. And then I'll dive into how Dataverse and the nonprofit common data model can support nonprofits in accelerating their missions, getting done what they want to get done faster than they may have been able to do otherwise. And I'll end with a discussion of the new capabilities that we're releasing in the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit. So those of you who either work with nonprofits or you have volunteered or nonprofits would love to connect about the ways in which we can support those activities. And as I mentioned, I'll begin by laying out a few of the challenges that the nonprofit sector faces. So even in a good year, and I'll talk about some of the impacts that the COVID-19 pandemic has had, in the best of times, nonprofits face numerous challenges around collaborating across different groups, especially if they work with external parties, with volunteers, understanding the constituents who they serve, as well as the donors who maybe are supporting their operations, who are passionate and committed to their missions, and also managing those donors' gifts and contributions, connecting those gifts' impact with the actual operations, the programs that the nonprofit runs, and then being able to drive insight as to whether a particular program has had the intended effect, the impact on the community where it's operating, because a lot of that data lives in silos. So that's operating a nonprofit in a good year. The expectations that donors have are continuing to evolve over time as well. So because we're living in the age of Web 2.0 evolving into Web 3.0, all of our commercial vendors are starting to build personalized relationships with us. People have the same expectations for the nonprofit community. So they want to know, who is my dollar helping? How is it helping them? Is my volunteer experience personalized? Am I being connected with the kinds of opportunities that mean the most to me? And these expectations mean that nonprofits have to adapt how they work and how they collect and work with their data. And that's been a trend over years. But in addition to this trend, there have been significant impacts on the nonprofit community as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, much like it's affected organizations across the private sector as well. So you can see just a few of the effects around the visualization here. Obviously, offices have closed, nonprofits have had to adapt to working remotely overnight, and this has particularly affected those who work in human services, social services, where there's a lot of in-person interaction, a lot of drop-in, things like that. Staff has been isolated, their revenues have been affected. They've had difficulty, fundraising in terms of the competing priorities that now exist in the market. And there's also the need to reorient to serve especially vulnerable communities from the services that were being previously provided to services around the pandemic. So as you can see, tons of fundraisers were canceled because in-person events were no longer viable. There were losses of income that were significant, job loss across the sector as well, and really a dampening of the revenue that's been raised. And Microsoft has long had a presence in the nonprofit world. You can see here some of the contributions that we've made as a company in terms of grants of software, of services, as well as being able to equip nonprofits with our broad portfolio of technology solutions. But we are always asking the question of, well, what else can we do? What should technology be doing? And that's led to a strategy where, in addition to providing those grants that I mentioned and engaging in various public sector strategic projects, we're also focusing on building technology and accelerating the adoption of technology, that digital transformation through data that I mentioned. So before we get into the specific ways in which Dataverse and the common data model for nonprofits support those organizations, I just want to spend a couple of minutes resetting the foundation around what Dataverse is. And again, for many of you, this is redundant, but for those of you who may be watching this for the first time or are new to this conversation, it's important to understand what we're talking about. So Dataverse is a technology that's emerged from numerous other Microsoft technologies, including SQL Server, but it layers on a lot of capabilities that allow you to store data in a structured format and include various forms of business logic around that data so that you can really go from how do I build an application, where do I put the data that I'm either collecting or including in that application, to having something running in production very rapidly without having to be a database administrator and expert in all of the configurations that would be required there. It's meant to accelerate the process by which an individual, an organization can get from, I have an idea for an application using the Microsoft Power Platform or one of the other capabilities here. You just heard a session about the ways in which Teams is now being used as a low-code, no-code development platform, all of which takes advantage of this data infrastructure and the logic that's built in there as well. As a quick example of how it's been already deployed in the nonprofit world, there's an organization that focuses on student success, student outcomes, that takes information in and uses Dataverse to store that information, as well as some of the other capabilities within the Power Platform, like Power Automate, to process that information once it's been ingested and accepted via Power Apps, then visualized within Power BI. And that information is being used to evaluate the applications that these students make, as well as to evaluate the progress of the organization in meeting the goals that it has in serving those students. So I'll drop the link to that case study into the chat as well if you want to take a look. That's one of our nonprofit case studies that takes advantage of the Power Platform as well as Dataverse. And this is something that you may have encountered as well, but as I mentioned, Dataverse isn't just storage. There's a layered sequence of capabilities that anyone who either is using the Power Platform or is using Dataverse in combination with Azure, which I'll talk about in a moment, can take advantage of. So at the core of everything we do, because as we say, Microsoft runs on trust, our security capabilities, making sure that you can control based on roles, who has access to what data, you can audit who has access to what data in what format. There's the logic that I mentioned. So in addition to using Dataverse as a data store, you can add business rules that allow you to do calculations, to do data rollups, to basically take advantage of various logic, basically, in this category. And then the forms of data that are accommodated are widespread because the kinds of storage, all grounded in Azure, that comprise the Dataverse system are also widespread. So it's not just traditional relational data. You can accept different kinds of semi-structured and unstructured data and integrate into various services for either analytics, version and code control, or streaming data and other capabilities within the Azure platform. So as I mentioned, it's built on top of Azure and it extends into Azure as your needs as either a developer of applications or a power user grow. So on the left-hand side, you'll see the Power Application, the Power App Platform application universe. Then you'll see the components within Azure that we take advantage of to store the different kinds of data you might be ingesting and working within, including both that structured and unstructured data. And then as your needs evolve, and perhaps you need to trigger different kinds of more sophisticated flows that are not accommodated by the business logic exclusively within Dataverse, you may want to use Azure Functions for additional scripts. You may want to use event hubs for any kinds of streaming data or for sending data into other systems, and extending into Data Lake to maintain an archive and store your data for long-term analytics. Additionally, one of the things that we've learned is that nonprofits have data in tons of different data stores already. So there are many popular CRM systems out there, different proprietary systems for doing case management, for keeping track of the impact that they've had. And we want to make sure that they can keep the data in the sources where it lives, if they want to keep the data there, which is why there's a broad set of connectors that Dataverse can take advantage of in order to bring data in and read data from third-party sources. So if you happen to work with a nonprofit, or you are at a nonprofit that has specific kinds of applications or solutions you're using now, you may be worried it won't interact well with the Microsoft ecosystem with Dataverse. This collection of connectors is always growing, and there's also the option of extending through your own custom connectors too. So please don't let that be a barrier. And the last thing I'll mention here before diving into the common data model and the nonprofit common data model specifically is that Dataverse is extensible into one of our other marquee products, Azure Synapse Analytics. So if you want to take the data there and do various kinds of sophisticated analysis, if you want to apply machine learning models you've built elsewhere, it's possible to bridge the two systems using Azure Synapse Link and get to insights rapidly that way as well. So Dataverse as a platform, as a system, implements the common data model. And what the common data model is it basically recognizes that it's not enough to just offer the low code, no code tools for building applications, as well as Dataverse for storing and managing and working with the data and applying the business rules. It's also necessary to have an opinion or a set of opinions about what kind of data are commonly being used by organizations across different sectors. So you heard mention of other industry clouds. Each of the industries that we focus on has a broad but fairly standard set of processes. So for example, in the nonprofit world, we work with different kinds of constituents. There are often donors, there are program participants, those folks who are receiving the services from the nonprofit, there are programs themselves, and there's an increasing goal of connecting data about program performance with data about financial performance. In retail, you may have a different set of necessary entities around the stores where your products are sold, the products themselves, different kinds of supply chain. In the world of healthcare, you may have other entities around patient care and doctor staffing, things like that. So we recognize that each of our industries has both a shared set of foundational entities that are probably used widely, and then some very specific ones. So a common data model, as I mentioned, it's basically it's a shared language. It's a shared set of foundational beliefs about what data is important to that industry and what data may form the foundation of any application that's being developed on top of Dataverse. But what it's not is it's not the application itself, right? So it's not enough to have the data storage and the common data model. you also need to be able to build those applications that provide those services, support those activities. And I'll talk in a few minutes about the specific ways in which we have tried to accelerate that development and invested there. But this is in a nutshell what the common data model is. And I'll move on to talk about the common data model for nonprofits in just a second. But for those of you for whom a common data model may be a newer idea, we have an analogy that we use, which is, think about reading a book with words that you may not have ever encountered for the first time. Or even if you're trying to read a book together as a book club in a group, you may have different ideas about what words mean. And what the common data model provides is a shared understanding of what words, terms, data categories are. And it allows you to make sense of all the information, all the words in that text. So essentially, you can read the book, and then you can start to understand the relationship between those concepts, those characters in the book. And on that basis, you can reach a deeper level of understanding. I'll give you just a quick example. I've been having lots of conversations with nonprofit data professionals recently, and I talked to somebody who worked at an international organization. They were talking about predictive analytics, and they had a confusing experience talking to their peer because the peer was doing predictive analytics, but the prediction was only until this year. And what they learned is that they were using data from a country that had a very different calendar. They were actually in a different year than the the initial data professional was assuming. So there are many contexts in which there are different understandings of what data mean, even if sometimes we think we're on the same page, which is why it's critical to have a common data model and that shared understanding. So the other thing that it allows you to do, which I think is understated, especially in the nonprofit sector, is it helps you get away from some of the very high costs of point-to-point integration potentially. I worked in the past in K-12 education. So any of you who may have worked in that field, or if you have children who are currently in the educational system, you know that increasingly there are lots of technology tools that are being used to manage students' grades, students' attendance, assignment to classes, busing if it's a school district or a region that provides busing. And every time a school district adopted a new piece of technology, they had to make sure that the data in the new piece of technology made sense relative to the data in the existing pieces of technology. And there was a lot of point-to-point integration. So data was extracted from one system, it had to be transformed, massaged, and entered into the other system. And then anytime you added another system to the constellation of technologies, you had to do the same process. So what you're able to do with a common data model is get rid of the necessity of point-to-point integration by integrating into a shared, ideally a shared data store like Dataverse, with a shared understanding of the data that's available and the data that each application can and should consume, governed by those controls that we mentioned. So it's a way of decoupling essentially, the application logic from the data. And we kind of talked about the way in which semantic standards support understanding across multiple systems or folders. So I won't belabor that point, but I do want to move on to the common data model for nonprofits specifically. And as I mentioned, there are multiple sector-specific, industry-specific common data models built on top of the common data model. This one in particular, it was led in partnership with various technology providers who serve the nonprofit sector, as well as nonprofits themselves. And it's open sourced on GitHub, so I'll share some of those links as well. And it's grounded in those organizations' understanding of what they need and what they do on a day-to-day basis that may be shared by other organizations. So you'll see here some of the key categories of nonprofit services operations, like program delivery. So every nonprofit exists to make an impact in the world, whether it's environmental or social services or arts and culture or religious. Most organizations have some fundraising mechanism, whether it's direct donations or grants from philanthropies from the government. There are finance operations that need to be managed. Grants might be awarded, and outcomes are measured and managed in order to inform which programs should continue, which programs require additional funding, so on and so forth. And in slightly greater detail, this has been a multi-year effort. Here you can see some positive feedback from one of the participants from Oxfam, so a large multinational nonprofit. And it's an open source project, as I mentioned. It's governed by the nonprofit CDM community in partnership with Microsoft. And it's meant to provide a framework like the common data model itself for the development of applications and those services. Clicking a little bit deeper in, you can see some of the specific capabilities, functions that the CDM for nonprofits enables. So it has more than 86 entities. It's got more than, or I think around 1,700 attributes, and it supports all of these strategic initiatives. But in order to get from model to initiative to actual application, there are still a couple of additional steps, and that's where I want to go to next, to talk about the ways in which we've sought to accelerate the work that nonprofits do and support it through our own Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit. Before I go there, I wanted to mention the resources you could look at if you're interested in delving deeper into the nonprofit common data model. So as I mentioned, there's the GitHub repository, and there's a broader community to manage that open source work, to think about what additional operations capabilities need to be activated inside that model. And you can join that community at nonprofitcdm.org or dive in and look at the GitHub repository. For a few key examples of the kinds of work and capabilities that the nonprofit data model is supporting, before I show you those accelerator applications themselves, you can see, and we won't delve into all of the specific nuances of the diagrams, but at a very high level, nonprofits want to be able to connect their structured data around their programs with their information about their constituents. And in my experience, supporting consulting for various nonprofits, it's not always the case that those are either, they may not be in the same system, the data may not be pooled anywhere, there may not be a concept of data warehousing or any kind of consolidated analytics. You may have folks who are in the field collecting data on paper that then potentially gets entered into a case management record keeping system. But then you have folks who are initiating programs who might be doing that completely elsewhere, either in spreadsheets or in a CRM, who may be doing outreach through various marketing tools. That needs to be brought together so that you can see this program has reached these participants and was funded by these donors who would like to be reported back to, in order to create that positive flywheel effect of data. The other capability, and I sort of alluded to that here, so you want to be able to map program participants to program delivery. You want to be able to map fundraising to program delivery as well. Something that we released a couple of weeks ago as part of our general availability launch of the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit is a program impact dashboard. So it's a Power BI dashboard. It's a template that any nonprofit can take up and use. And what it allows you to do is use the common data model structure to connect information about which programs you're running and where the funding for those programs came from and what the direct impact across your organization's goals was from that funding. I'll show you that demo dashboard in just a moment, but this is actually a very significant challenge for nonprofits. If you look at most nonprofits' websites, annual reports, they'll talk about their impact, often in terms of the number of people served, the specific delta in the quality of life or the environmental quality or what have you. And then they'll have a separate section that talks about their finances. That'll be auditing, various kinds of financial reporting, but the two are rarely connected. And they're even more rarely connected on an operational day-to-day basis. And that's what this particular view here is meant to enable. So to sum up why the common data model was such a critical investment for the field, as well as for Microsoft and for the partners we worked with, there are lots of platforms and tools out there that serve nonprofits, but very, very few of them talk to one another. Often nonprofits are stuck trying to cram their data into one system because it's just so hard and expensive and laborious and in many cases brittle to get those systems to talk to one another. So unlike those systems, what we're able to support with the nonprofit common data model is deeper integration between the logical concepts that may exist in different tools and show you a holistic view of the performance of the organization. And as I mentioned, it's great to have a platform that folks can build on like Dataverse. It's great to have a generic and a subject or an industry specific data model, but you also need tools that take advantage of those models, right? Otherwise, it's like having a theme park without any rides in it. So the first initiative that Microsoft participated in to accelerate some of the work on top of the common data model was called the Nonprofit Accelerator, aptly enough. And what this is, it's also available on GitHub, and it's a suite of applications that any partner or any nonprofit can pick up and start building on in order to meet some of these specific goals around managing constituents, fundraising, award delivery, and volunteer management. So let me see, I don't have a link here, but I will drop a link later on into the chat for you all to take a look at. These take advantage of the Power Platform. They can connect with Office 365, and they deploy with the CDM at their base. So you could rapidly go from, not having any sense of how your data should be structured to having live applications with the common data model with a shared understanding of the data at their core. As a quick example, here are a couple of the applications that you can stand up using that accelerator: project management and program design, as well as case management, right? So you may need to be able to get your program data out of the minds of the people who currently run the programs, out of spreadsheets into a shared application that can be accessed. And you may want to be able to manage the cases. So the individuals or families or groups who are being served by your nonprofit, having an application. Thank you. And my colleague Gustavo just dropped the link to the accelerator into the chat. By the way, we've also just launched a new set of innovation capabilities for nonprofits too, on top of the common data model and on top of the existing capabilities we have. But this is what the Nonprofit Accelerator enabled. And we also have a capability called the Nonprofit Data Warehouse Quick Start. So for those organizations that have reached the level of maturity that they know they need to have a data warehouse, they know they need to be able to consolidate data from multiple sources, to be able to get to rapid insight on top of that data, and perhaps conform not just to the common data model, but maybe to other data standards. Like there's an international aid data standard that we have conform to in the solution. You can deploy one version or the other. You also have some pre-populated data sets there from the World Health Organization around water and sanitation. And it also has, similar to the Power BI template I mentioned earlier that I'll show you in just a moment, there are Power BI templates there in that quick start too. So that's something that if you work with nonprofit organizations or you work at a nonprofit organization, you can pick up and rapidly deploy with scripts that are all there for you, as well as a walkthrough guide, and see what the advantages, the benefits of a data warehouse might be for your organization. And you can start populating it with data immediately that can conform and feed into the folders that are tied to the common data model. This is just a graphic representation of what that might look like. So rather than having data live in multiple different sources and trying to do either point-to-point connections like we discussed, or trying to do some sort of data extraction and synthesis in Excel, which is error prone to data being out of date, you can start to consolidate that and do that all either collaboratively or individually using the Nonprofit Data Warehouse Quick Start. So that's been, just to recap where we've been on this journey. We talked about Dataverse foundations. We talked about the conceptual benefits of the common data model and the open source tools that we've released and are continuing to release. Now I'd like to switch gears and talk about the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit and some of those first-party capabilities that we're enabling and we're making available on top of some of the same foundations. So this is probably a refresher for most of you. These are the components of the Microsoft Cloud, right? Most of what we build rests on Microsoft Azure as its foundation. The Power Platform can extend those capabilities through no-code, low-code development. We have productivity capabilities in Microsoft 365. We have LinkedIn as part of the Microsoft family that allows, potentially donor managers and folks who are involved in fundraising to reach better insights about the people they're trying to reach. And we have Microsoft Dynamics, which of course is the foundation for the CRM that we have available, for fundraising and engagement, and for some of the volunteer management and volunteer engagement capabilities that we've just made available earlier this month. But to get a bit more granular, you can see how the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit at the top here, takes advantage of all of those capabilities that are broad across Microsoft, that the other industry clouds take advantage of, that we as individuals, users, developers take advantage of on a day-to-day basis. But at the foundation, there's Dataverse, and there's the common data model for nonprofits. So as I show you the capabilities, you'll see the technologies that are being taken advantage of or built on top of in the development of each of those capabilities. And Dataverse and the common data model will be a key feature of most of those. On the left-hand side here, you'll see the various capabilities that we're enabling for nonprofits. So what we talked about, everything from fundraising and engagement, the quick start, being able to connect to the various tools that nonprofits use already. But on the right-hand side, I want to call out the fact that this isn't something that we're doing alone. We have hundreds, if not thousands, of partners involved in this process, both independent software vendors who are building on top of the common data model or extending the capabilities inside the accelerator, and various partners who provide advisory services, staffing extension, skilling, system integration capabilities to the nonprofit sector. So there was a wonderful research survey that TechSoup recently conducted on the nonprofit technology landscape, essentially. And they looked at, well, how many staff members does a nonprofit have across the world, across different kinds of countries, different kinds of organizations, and the numbers are, as you can imagine, quite low. So nonprofits rely on the broader ecosystem of technology vendors, partners, advisors to help them make the best of the technology resources they have. And similarly, we as Microsoft rely on you all and on that ecosystem to both build on top of what we've made available, as well as make it configure it and tailor it for the specific nonprofits you work with. So at a high level, when we talk about the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit, we organize this industry cloud, like most of our industry clouds, around what we call industry priority scenarios. So in consultation and conversation with organizations in the field, we've determined what are some of the key areas where we want to invest in the immediate and the middle term. And these areas are understanding your supporters and donors. So we began the conversation by highlighting some of the challenges that nonprofits face, some of the expectations that donors have today, and understanding them, knowing when and how they engage with your organization, what their expectations are, who potentially might become move from being a one-time donor to a regular donor, might move from being a volunteer to a donor, and vice versa. All of this is critical information that nonprofits are starting to collect, and we want to help them consolidate on top of the common data model. Second, we want to make sure that nonprofits are able to deliver effective programming. So the way in which they're able to make the difference they want to make in the world is by designing projects, programs, services that meet the needs of the people, the environment, the groups they're trying to serve. And finally, we want to make sure that they're able to do that rapidly and quickly. So in another conversation I had with a nonprofit data professional, they told me that sometimes it takes months to collect data from partners. Then there has to be a lot of cleanup, management of that data, and in some cases, months later or weeks later, you find out that the data doesn't actually tell you what you want to know. It doesn't tell you if you're hitting your mission outcomes or if you need to redirect your resources or change your strategy. So we want to get to insight faster. Move from data that's just being collected and reported annually on an annual report basis, where it gets updated once on a website, to data that gets collected regularly, looked at regularly, is highly trusted in terms of making day-to-day operational decisions, and then ideally data that can then be used for advanced analytics, machine learning, making predictions and forecasts about the future. But all of that starts with a foundation of data that you understand and data that you trust, both of which the nonprofit common data model support, and all of which rests on that foundation of security and compliance. So as you can imagine, the private sector, there's lots of sensitive data around customers. In the social sector, there's lots of sensitive data around program participants, around donors, and in many cases, program participants are among the most vulnerable people in society. Their data needs to be held securely and protected. And that's at the core of everything we build. Dialing it a little bit deeper into what each of those scenarios means, if we start at the top with understanding your donors and supporters, that includes a few things. It includes personalized engagement, so knowing when to reach out to people and how. It includes managing those constituents and making sure that you have people's most up-to-date contact information, that you're not duplicating messages to them, which is both costly and can be frustrating to the individuals at the receiving end, and that you're then managing those donations and distributing awards in a way that's consistent with with their expectations. In order to deliver effective programming, we've released a couple of capabilities that I'll show in just a moment around volunteer management, and we're increasingly working to support program delivery. So most nonprofits rely on a lot of extra hands in the form of volunteers, and making sure that those volunteers are vetted in the necessary ways, right? Especially if they're working with sensitive program participants, and that those volunteers have a positive experience is key to keep them coming back, to make sure they stay supporters and advocates for your organization. And on the accelerating mission outcomes piece at the bottom left, there's the strong need to unify data and to be able to perform analytics on top of the data that you've collected and consolidated in order to inform that positive cycle of personalized engagement with your donors and with your volunteers. And if we take it even a step deeper, you can see a map of the ways in which we are working to support the sector. So at the top level, you can see the various functions that a nonprofit performs, everything from connecting with constituents and fundraising, program delivery, internal operations, and then the insight that drives the positive feedback loop. Over time, our ability to serve these capabilities has grown. So you'll see there are, and I'm not sure if the slides aren't animating in my view. Hopefully they're animating in yours. You can see the ways in which our commitment has grown from the common data model through the accelerator, through fundraising and engagement, through the commitments and the products we're releasing now around volunteer management, extensions to fundraising and engagements, and the work that we're doing now around understanding the data needs of the nonprofit sector. And you can see here a slightly different view of understanding those capabilities in terms of what we've made available across those functional areas. On the left-hand side, starting with fundraising and engagements, the kinds of pieces of the Microsoft ecosystem that are being used and activated, everything from Dynamics and Azure through LinkedIn, through Power BI, pieces of the Power Platform, including Power Apps and portals, and then into Teams and SharePoint. So we see Teams as a very significant point of interaction between nonprofit professionals internal to organizations, nonprofit professionals and their volunteers, and some of the capabilities that you learned about in your last session having to do with the development of applications on top of Teams are a key area of investigation for us as well. Just to give you a sense of our timeline, so over the couple of years since the nonprofit common data model got established, we've had a rapid tempo of development across the capabilities that I mentioned. And I'm going to dive in and show you some of those nonprofit specific capabilities in our last 10 minutes before we go to Q&A. But we began investing in fundraising and engagement, which has since evolved, volunteer management, volunteer engagement. Those are slightly different capabilities, which I'll show you in just a moment. And we're continuing to both broaden and support as a generally available set of services, these capabilities. And just to show you, as I mentioned, what these services and capabilities are, to give you a slightly firmer grounding of what they look like and what the specific products that they're built on top of. Here you can see volunteer management. It's a fairly familiar interface if you've worked with Dynamics before. What it lets you do is it lets you configure opportunities for volunteers to sign up for through the portal that's also made available. It lets you keep track of volunteers' history of engagement, their tempo of engagement, so that you can start to build journeys and profiles for them to ensure that you're able to re-engage with them when the right opportunities come up. You're able to do very tactical things like scheduling, communication inside the service, and you're also able to track those activities to make sure that they're connecting with your program intended outcomes. And you can see here that it's built on top of the common data model. So all of this data, if you have other applications that would benefit from having this data, can be understood using that shared set of entities. And it's built on top of Power Apps as well. Volunteer engagement is where volunteers themselves would go to search for opportunities. They would build out profiles, and that's a way of collecting information and learning more about your volunteer group and the folks who are involved. They can do their own scheduling. They can authenticate and ensure that their data is securely stored and managed. And this too rests on top of the nonprofit common data model. So if you have volunteers who are signing up using volunteer engagement, you can make that data available immediately in the fundraising and engagement module. You could also make it available in other applications that rely on the same data logic. As I mentioned, we're working increasingly to integrate these capabilities into the rest of the Microsoft portfolio. So there's a Teams template that allows staff to manage the volunteer workflow, essentially. So imagine you have volunteers who fill out an application. You need to send them back some forms for identity verification. You need to make sure they go through certain kinds of training. All of this can be managed without having to constantly go back into the volunteer engagement, volunteer management modules. You can do it through these notifications in Teams and execute your tasks there without interrupting your regular workflow. Similarly, we've launched on SharePoint a set of templated sites that can be used to showcase volunteer opportunities, help them find information. So, the theme here, hopefully, that you've noticed is that we don't think it's enough to just, give nonprofits general tools. Nonprofits need very specific tools to meet the needs of their various operating groups, and providing them with these templates that are more advanced but built on top of the shared common data model and the shared understanding helps them get to the point of being able to do what they want to do faster, to drive those changes they want to see in the world without having to figure out, how do I build a SharePoint site from scratch? How do I integrate these workflows into Teams? And that set of capabilities under the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit is only going to continue growing. Some of the existing capabilities I mentioned that rest atop the nonprofit common data model, as well as Dynamics in Azure, for Azure's being used for payment processing. So you can see here the ability to manage information about the folks who are donating to your organization and who are supporting your organization, being able to connect to LinkedIn Sales Navigator to get deeper insight into some of their professional information, whatever they've chosen to share there, and being able to put together campaigns, marketing lists, which is a huge area of focus for fundraising teams in order to make sure that they're maintaining a regular conversation and reaching out on a regular basis to the folks who are advocates or supporters. Along those lines, as I mentioned, you want to be able to understand and build a model of a donor's or a volunteer's journey of engagement with you. So one of our newer solutions is called constituent marketing journeys. And they, once again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I want to highlight the fact that we're taking advantage of the nonprofit common data model in all of these cases. What this lets you do is design a basic template of how somebody might engage with your organization, what the forms of outreach would be after the initial way in which they connect. Depending on how they connect, you may want to reach out to them at a different pace in different ways. If somebody's volunteering for an event, you may have a different thank you note and then a different solicitation that you'll send them versus somebody who you've just connected with on social media or so on and so forth. So it gives nonprofits essentially a way of building out personas for their different constituents and then designing a path for engaging with those constituents on a regular recurring basis, so you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you have a new engagement with one of your donors or volunteers. And finally, the program impact dashboard that I mentioned, it lets you bring those pieces of data together. So we looked at the high level diagram of what it means to connect program performance data with some of your financial data. And this brings that to life. So once again, grounded in the nonprofit common data model, but this takes advantage of Power BI and lets you connect directly to those entities. If you're using the common data model, the data will flow in and you can visualize and look at on a, as rapidly as your data updates, that's as quickly as you can, how quickly you can see the changes in your program impact. So it's enabling nonprofits to move once again from that frozen in time single shot reporting on an annual basis to a regular sense of their program performance that is of critical interest both to the folks who are running those programs as well as to funders and to board members who want to make sure that they're steering the organization in the right way. And just as we began with a quick story about the education nonprofit that's using Dataverse and the Power Platform to accomplish their goals in terms of student performance, student achievement. Here you can see a quote from the Chief Information Officer from the Make-A-Wish Foundation, who said that, without centralizing technology services, what they wanted to do simply wouldn't have been possible. And we believe that the nonprofit common data model is a central component of being able to bring services together and make sure those services are speaking the same language. And Dataverse takes a lot of that burden off of the nonprofits who are doing critical work. We want to make sure that they're spending their time out doing the work they want to do in society and not tweaking with IT configurations and settings. So I'll pause there. I know I ran through this quite quickly, but very grateful for your time. I really appreciate you listening in and to your commitment to serving the nonprofit sector. And I'm happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Thank you, Alex. So let's take a look if there's any questions here. Okay, so you've shared obviously the industry accelerator, which is really good. Rory, hi there, Rory. Rory saying, looks amazing, but how do we get started?
Sure, that's a great question. It depends on what you want to get started with. So if you want to get started with the Microsoft Cloud for Nonprofit capabilities that I mentioned broadly, there's a link here to microsoft.com/nonprofits, and you can see everything that's generally available. And if you are at a nonprofit organization and you're not currently, if you haven't already been engaged with Microsoft, there's a process of certification or validation that you meet the nonprofit criteria, which is fairly quick. You just have to provide some information about the organization. You get sent back the validation, and that opens up various services and capabilities and grants. So for example, there's an Azure grant, there are other discounts that you can take advantage of. And if you want to build specific, if you already work with Microsoft and you want to take advantage of specific capabilities, the Cloud for Nonprofit tools that I mentioned are all in the Solution Center if you're already working in Dynamics. If you're not, we have both sales and implementation teams, and I believe there's a contact form on the nonprofit site as well. Or if you just want to play with the open source solutions and take a look at those, my colleague dropped a link in, and you can start there and either leave comments or fork it and start doing your own work. We've got another couple of questions here.
Yes, there's a question, Rory, again. What if we are a Dynamics partner that just wants to work out how it all fits together?
So that's a great question. We've recently moved from having getting started guides that were large documents stored on GitHub to having published all of our getting started for fundraising and engagement, volunteer management, what have you, on Microsoft Docs. So I can make sure that we share with you a link to our overall documentation and the ways in which you would onboard any one of these modules. The goal of the cloud is to make it possible to use all or some of it, depending on what your interests are. So I would start there. I think fundraising and engagement and volunteer management and engagement are the more robust pieces, as well as some of the components in the Innovation Hub on GitHub that I mentioned. And if you have specific questions around how those pieces work together, I think our team will be engaging in GitHub and responding to questions and seeing, what kind of feedback or concerns people have.
So Abdul is asking, we are managing multiple projects, donations, orphan aids, expenses. Do you have any idea what application suits to us?
I'd have to understand more about the specific use case. So as a product manager, I don't like to jump to solutioning. I think some of the capabilities that I've described specific to managing donations. That's what our fundraising and engagement module is for. Depending on the kind of project management you're doing, it could also be a fit if it's specifically programs versus if you're doing various kinds of internal project management. There may be other tools that are better suited for that. If you're supporting orphans, you can keep track of them as constituents using our platform, either the program delivery component that's in the nonprofit accelerator, or you can keep track of them as beneficiaries as well. Expenses, again, it sort of depends on what kind of expenses are you currently connecting to other accounting systems or ERP. What I would recommend would depend a lot on your existing technology footprint, because I don't want to get in the way of what you're doing. I would want to be able to support it. So I would take a look at the capabilities and then reach out, make sure that your nonprofit organization is a participant in the nonprofit program, and then you would get access to all of these.
So there's another question by Abdul. So there is no one application. We need multiple applications. Am I right?
So it's all basically modular on top of Dynamics, at least the fundraising and engagement and the volunteer management. You would go to Solution Center and you can deploy them in the same breath, and then they would both be available to you inside your Dynamics instance. So it would still look and feel like one application. It just, you have to deploy them individually.
So does that answer your question, Abdul, in relation to the various solution modules available for the accelerator? And whilst we wait, any other questions? So first of all, I have to say there are lots of great questions being asked here. And I think often the big question we've been getting, Alex, from most of the sessions when it comes to the accelerator, it really is just how do you get started and how can you start using it? How can partners even? Because I think 80% of our attendees are Microsoft partners, and even they often struggle with, okay, how can we show a customer this accelerator solution? So can you give us any advice on how even a Microsoft partner can just get started with, or a customer who's interested can just get started with actually seeing and feeling the application?
So this may not be a fully satisfying answer, but one of the things that we're working on are industry solution kits that would allow partners to demo our capabilities in much the same way that we build internal tools for our sales force to demonstrate the same capabilities. So at the moment, a partner would likely have to stand up the solution themselves by going through the implementation process. But without specifying a concrete timeline, we're working to make that easier without having to do all of the work, to just have an out-of-the-box demo solution. So the only thing I can say there is stay tuned, but it's definitely an area of focus and awareness.
Great stuff. So finally, Abdul asks, so the out-of-the-box applications like sales, customer service will not work for us. So Abdul, is that a question or a conclusion? I would agree that sales and customer services is very specific, and this industry solution obviously is tailored towards your industry vertical. But again, as Alex answered, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve versus just switching it on and using it, right, Alex?
Yeah, and please feel free to reach out to me either on LinkedIn or via email, and I'd be happy to either dive into your use case with you or connect you with the right folks to better understand the specific needs of the organization you're working with.
So there you go, Abdul. So you've got Alex's email there, alexi.kasavin at microsoft.com. So Alex is probably the best person you can even speak to, right? I mean, you've got the main man right there at your fingertips to help you answer your question. And then also Tom Northrup is saying, as a partner, I implemented the accelerator on a trial instance by loading it from AppSource. Okay, fantastic. Eduardo is saying, does D365 Is D365 a requirement for using non-profit common data model?
So that's a great question. It's absolutely not. Any application built on Microsoft platforms or not can take advantage of the data model, right? The data model is basically it's a logical construct. It's a set of tables and columns that help you transform what a nonprofit does into into the world of data. You could build an application that's on other services, take advantage of those same entities, and then potentially connect that data into a D365 service or Azure or what have you. So it's certainly not a requirement to use the nonprofit CDM. It is a requirement to use some of the specific modules that we have that take advantage of the nonprofit common data model.
And Graham Rosk is asking for a partner. Is it as simple as creating a new environment and deploying the solution in order to demo to prospects?
Yes, there are some pieces. So for example, fundraising and engagement, because it takes advantage of Azure, there's a ARM template that you'd have to run and make sure that the necessary Azure components are available too. But that's, that was probably the most complex piece.
Awesome. Okay.
Somebody's got their hand raised.
Ah, right. It's Victor. Victor has got his hand up. Let's unmute Victor. I
Can you
think
hear
he
me,
may
Russ?
have. Oh, yes, we can hear you. Hi there,
Oh,
Victor.
Yes.
hello, hello. So I got a question, and I think it's more generic to all of these verticals, if you will, that Microsoft's putting out there for free. There is a lot of effort from the community to create apps, be it Power Apps, portals, and things around the nonprofit, for example. How can we work together so that these are also made available to the community in the same fashion that Power Automate community connectors are now creeping up into the tool itself?
That's a really good question. I don't know that we're quite at so the Innovation Hub that I mentioned just got released as part of the NetHope conference this week. I imagine, and Gustavo, if he's still on, may be able to speak to this too. The goal is to cultivate a community around that, have folks contribute either code samples or starters. We're not quite there yet. I think the goal is to get there. I can't speak on behalf of the other clouds, but I imagine the same idea will apply, right? Because we'll never be able to build every specific use case that a participant in any of these industries will want, but we want to be able to connect to it, highlight what's being built in the community, and that's something that I think we need to grow towards. But my first step would be to connect with the folks who are running that in the nonprofit innovation hub on GitHub, and I can help if there's something that you have in mind particularly. I can connect you with them, and we can see how the solution might fit as part of that portfolio.
And
Thank you.
final question by Bhaskar is, how can we easily demo some portal stuff to non-profit clients without worrying about signing up for a new one every time?
So that's what we're working through. And again, if you don't want to set up the demo environment in the way that Tom had mentioned and maintain it, that's what we want to be able to provide you, sort of an out of the box demo kit. But at the moment, you would have to set it up and show it to them in the environment that you've configured.
Fantastic. So again, I want to thank you, Alex, for taking through this non-profit accelerator. I think it is a huge industry, I have to admit. Financial services, healthcare, and non-profit, I have to admit, are some of the largest industries in the Microsoft ecosystem. So thank you so much for taking your time out. I know it's a very busy week for Microsoft this week. So I want to thank you for taking your time out of your schedule to share this insight to everyone. So Alex, do you have any final announcements or comments to make?
Well, a couple of things. So one, watch the space. This will continue to grow now that it's GA. And if any of you work with nonprofits or are at nonprofits, I'm currently looking to connect with as many nonprofit data professionals as possible. So would love to get their perspective, learn from them, to make sure that, as always, we're continuing to build with their specific needs and challenges in mind. So very grateful, Roz, for this opportunity to present, and thank you all for your insightful questions, and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Well, thank you, Alex. There you have Alex. We've shared your contact details in the chat. And Eric's also shared some information as well about the Nonprofit Innovation Hub as well. So there you have that, nonprofit innovation at Microsoft.com. Thank you, Eric, for sharing that bit of information. Okay, we're at the end of the hour, and a lot of questions and very, very timely questions, because